Lena had always loved the warmth of the sun, that soft, penetrating sensation that seemed to warm not only her skin, but also her soul. The light breeze caressing his face, bringing with it a freshness that contrasted pleasantly with the summer heat. The light scent of chlorine in the air evoked a feeling of purity, almost a return to basics, a way to purify oneself, to free oneself. The pool was a sanctuary for her, a place where the outside world, with its expectations and judgments, seemed to slip away, leaving only the silence of the waves, the murmur of the water and her own breathing. Every immersion in the crystal-clear water was an escape. Each dive, a way of reconnecting with what really mattered to her, her inner peace. It was his little moment of escape. A moment of solitude, where she was neither the black woman in a society full of prejudices, nor the architect in a world where her identity seemed an exception. It was just her, in a place that didn't judge her. She had searched for this moment for a long time, throughout her demanding career. It was more than a luxury, it was a silent victory, a deserved reward for the years spent fighting, moving forward with perseverance, even when doors closed in front of her or invisible obstacles stood in her way. The five-star hotel she was in now was just a physical manifestation of that victory. She had not been invited there by influential friends, nor by chance. She got there through her own hard work, her own determination. Lena had not grown up in a world of luxury. She came from a modest neighborhood, where dreams were often relegated to simple survival. There, skin color, social status and gender were invisible but heavy chains that kept most people at the bottom of the ladder. Her hard-working parents barely had enough to provide for the family's basic needs, and she often had to fight for opportunities that others took for granted. But Lena wasn't the type to let her past define her. She had transformed it into a motivation, a fuel that allowed her to move forward. That morning, after a busy day at the architecture firm where she worked, she had decided to go to this luxury hotel, a place she had always seen from the outside, a world she had never thought she could reach, but which she contemplated with growing ambition. It had been a long day, filled with difficult meetings and negotiations, compromises and decisions to be made in a male-dominated environment. As a black woman in such a competitive field, every step had been a challenge. She had to constantly prove that she was as capable, or even more capable, than her white male colleagues. The condescending looks, the whispers behind her back, the questions she constantly received about her origins, about her qualifications, these little subtle attacks that tried to reduce her to a simple anomaly in an environment foreign to her skin color, were invisible wounds. Yet every time she faced them, Lena grew stronger, more determined to prove that she was here to stay. She had faced many challenges over the years, but what set her apart from others was her ability to stay calm and focused. She had learned not to be carried away by the winds of subtle racism, not to respond to every microaggression. Because, in his mind, true victory lay in consistency, in always moving forward despite the challenges. She knew the path to the top wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the only one worth taking. Today, she enjoyed every second of this quiet moment by the pool. The luxury around her, the dazzling whiteness of the deck chairs and the perfection of the water no longer shocked her. She almost felt at home there, not as a guest, but as a person who deserved her place here as much as anyone. She was not an intruder, she was the living example that you could, despite everything, conquer this world and impose yourself. The hotel was, for most, a haven of luxury reserved for the wealthy, a place where the smell of power hung in the air. The guests were often the types of people who thought they were untouchable, those who didn't have to worry about the little worries of life. People who came here didn't need to say much to make it clear that they were at the top of the social hierarchy. Space seemed to magnetize those who had the means to access it, like a sort of exclusive club. But Lena didn't feel intimidated by this world. In fact, it was almost fun for her. These people, who believed they had power simply because they could afford an escapade like this, did not understand that real power did not come from money, but from the ability to resist, to rise up, to maintain oneself in a hostile environment without ever letting themselves be crushed. Lena wasn't one of them, but that day, that moment was hers. She had carved out her own place in this world. And this universe, although inaccessible to most people like her, had offered her a small window, a glimpse into a dream of her own making. Her hard-earned money as an architect allowed her access to this world. She knew it was just a moment, but it was a moment she fully savored. She felt like she belonged here, even though deep down she knew there was still so much left to accomplish. It was then that he appeared. A man of around 40, with a closed and arrogant face, walked with a confident step, as if he were moving in a world that belonged to him. His perfectly cut Italian suit seemed like a second skin, every fold, every detail carefully thought out to display his success and status. He moved with deliberate slowness, as if he wanted each movement, each gesture, to be a message in itself. His piercing blue eyes scanned the space around him with a methodical coldness, as if he were searching for something, or perhaps someone. For a moment, his gaze fell on Lena, and the moment was enough for him to pause imperceptibly. A quiver of hesitation, a tiny movement of doubt in his eyes, before certainty takes over. He walked straight towards her, as if he knew exactly where he was going, without worrying about the slightest obstruction. His smile, slightly superior, slowly appeared on his lips, like a mask that he put on to better assert his position. This smile was not friendly, it was imbued with an icy smugness, as if the mere fact of being there made him the main actor in the scene. When he reached Lena, he stopped abruptly, his eyes fixing on her in an almost accusatory manner. "Excuse me, miss, you're in the wrong place," he said, his voice chilling, marked with an authority that brooked no discussion. There was nothing friendly or courteous in his tone, just an order disguised as a question, a tax declaration. Lena slowly looked up at him, surprised by the implicit aggression in his words, but also by the confidence he displayed. There was nothing open or curious in his gaze. It was a quick assessment, an immediate judgment about his place in this space. However, she does not react immediately. She knew that this kind of attitude, this kind of smug look, was nothing new to her. She had seen others. But something in the way he carried himself, in the quiet arrogance he exuded, encouraged her not to give in. There was no explicit threat, but in his posture and in his gaze, there was a form of disdain, of almost palpable condescension, as if the simple truth of his presence was enough to rewrite the rules of the place. She took a second to weigh her words. She could have ignored the attack and continued to enjoy her quiet time, but this man wasn't going to leave without a response. She held his gaze without faltering, refusing to give in to the gratuitous aggression he seemed to want to impose. "I'm sorry, but I think you're wrong," she replied in a calm, almost icy, but confident voice, leaving no room for weakness. "I'm here to enjoy the pool, just like any other guest." These words, simple but firm, were like a shield against the intrusion of this man into his moment of peace. She didn't have to explain further, but she felt that this moment, this face-to-face encounter, went beyond this hotel and this precise moment. It touched on something larger, more intimate, his place in this world. The man, clearly irritated by her response, raised his eyebrows with a disdainful pout. His eyes scanned her up and down, as if he could barely see her, a blurred silhouette, an anomaly in his landscape of luxury and perfection. "You don't seem like one of our regular customers," he said in a tone that suggested he was beyond any doubt. His eyes scanned her, from her body to her clothes, and judgment was evident in every movement of his pupils. "I advise you to leave," he added in a sharper tone, this time almost threatening. "You can't be here." His words were like orders disguised as advice, imbued with excessive certainty. He expected her to obey, to give in, to feel inferior and to leave the scene. But Lena does not give in. She stood up slowly, her muscles tense beneath the calm surface of her face. The breeze, gentle and comforting, blew through his hair, as if to encourage him to hold his ground. This look, this judgment, this behavior, she had experienced them too often in her life to ignore them. She was not an intruder. She wasn't going to back down, neither in this hotel nor in life. She had no intention of giving in. Not today. Not now. "I'm sorry, but I think you're wrong," she said as she stood up, a calm confidence emanating from her words. She wasn't asking for her place here, she was asserting it. "I'm a customer, and I have no intention of leaving this place." The man's gaze grew even colder, if that was possible. He was now visibly annoyed, and it showed in every fiber of his being. I'm going to be very clear. You are not welcome here. You have no business being in a private pool at this hotel. His words were harsh, sharp, like invisible knives that sought to cut her off from her right to exist in this space.
Y cal security.
His tone left no room for discussion. He no longer sought to convince, but to impose, to break this confrontation on his own ground. Lena felt anger rising within her, like a wave just waiting to break. The heat that invaded his cheeks was not simply the reaction to a banal insult, but to a dull humiliation, accumulated in his veins for too long. She wasn't here to fight, or to challenge that kind of person. But, in this moment, accepting this situation, accepting that he dehumanized her in this way, was simply unthinkable. His breathing became deeper, his mind focused on that little spark of indignation that was beginning to ignite. Before he could say anything more, the sound of hurried footsteps caught his attention. Another man, a member of the hotel staff, arrived at full speed, probably alerted by the noise. He wore the sober but neat uniform of the employees, and his gaze immediately fell on Lena, as if trying to assess the situation without judgment. "Is everything okay here, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calm, but firmly rooted in professional politeness. His gaze then turned to the arrogant man, but the latter did not grant him a single moment of respite. The arrogant man turned abruptly towards the newcomer, his face hard with irritation. "She refuses to leave the pool," he said, the words falling from his mouth with the same arrogance as if he were announcing an unforgivable transgression, an act he deemed unacceptable. "She is not allowed to be here. Make her leave immediately." His voice had taken on an almost threatening tone, as if his authority and his position as a regular gave him the right to expel anyone at his convenience. But the employee, after observing the scene, approached with a more confident step. He knew that his position was not to defend a simple client, but to defend the legitimacy and dignity of everyone who was here as a client. His gaze lingered on Lena for a moment, trying to capture the tension in her eyes, before responding in a firmer, more calm voice. "Sir, I fear you are misinformed. Madam Lena is a paying customer, with every right to be here. You have no authority to evict her." His words were weighed, precise, like sword blows against the verbal violence of the first man. The arrogant man, furious at being contradicted, frowned, his jaw tightening in humiliation. He didn't like being stood up to, and even less so when a simple employee dared to challenge him in public. "How dare you challenge my instructions?" he shouted, contempt clear in his voice. "I'm a regular at this hotel.
I know the rules better than you."
He got carried away, forgetting the essential, that the rule was fairness and not the self-proclaimed hierarchy. The employee, however, remained calm and unwavering. "The rules apply to everyone, sir. There are no exceptions." Silence settled for a tense moment, heavy with unsaid words and pent-up resentments. The arrogant man, after hearing the employee's firm response, measured the situation. His eyes moved from Lena to the employee, looking for a way out, a way to maintain his posture of superiority. He blinked, and in that moment of thought, Lena could almost feel his anger bubbling beneath the surface. She didn't move, didn't react, but part of her knew that this silence was a form of struggle in itself. Finally, his anger escalated. He abruptly turned on his heel, as if he wanted to erase all traces of this confrontation, and walked away briskly, sulking in defeat. The arrogance of his gesture only accentuated the humiliation he had just suffered. He was probably used to the world bending to his wishes and rules. But that wasn't the case here. Not today. Lena remained calm, anchored in an inner silence, a deep tranquility that contrasted with the storm that was brewing inside her. She wasn't looking for confrontation, but her inner indignation was a holy fire, growing and consuming every free space left in her thoughts. She knew that what she had just experienced was not an isolated incident. It wasn't just an altercation with an arrogant customer, but a reflection of the way people like him, powerful, influential, convinced of their superiority, viewed people like her. She was well aware that in another context, without the presence of the employee who had defended her, the outcome would have been very different. She took a deep breath, sitting up on her deck chair, and after a few minutes of reflection, she stood up. Her movements were slow, measured, as if each step she took toward the hotel office was an affirmation of her dignity. She knew what she had to do. It was not enough to let this incident pass. She had to talk about it. Not out of a desire for revenge, but because she didn't want this kind of treatment to become the norm. She deserved better. The others too. Arriving at reception, she spoke to the manager. A man of around 50, with an affable and smiling appearance, but whose eyes betrayed a form of surprise. He was clearly taken aback by the event, as if this type of situation was not part of his daily concerns. Lena, however, did not let herself be destabilized by the manager's somewhat embarrassed expression. She calmly but firmly explained what had happened, detailing every moment of the confrontation, every word the arrogant man said, and the way he had treated her. The manager listened attentively, without interrupting, but his face closed as he understood the seriousness of the incident. He took notes and promised to investigate immediately. Lena knew she couldn't expect everything to change immediately, but the act of speaking out, of claiming her place, had already begun to restore balance in her mind. The fight, however small, had begun. After a few hours of investigation and internal discussions, management decided to take action. The situation had taken a more serious turn than the manager had first imagined. The arrogant guest, who turned out to be an influential investor in the city, was suspended from the hotel and banned from its premises. An unprecedented decision in the history of the establishment, which sent a strong message. The hotel would not tolerate this type of behavior. It was not a simple question of protocol, but of human respect. When the man returned, determined to collect his belongings, he did not expect what awaited him. As he walked through the hotel doors, he was not greeted by the polite smiles of the staff, as he had probably hoped. Instead, he found himself faced with a group of impeccably aligned employees, their gazes fixed and professional.
No smiles, just calm, firm faces.
The hotel manager, standing behind his desk, was waiting for him, as if the situation had already been decided long ago. "You are no longer welcome here, sir," the headmaster said in a calm but implacable voice. His tone was clear, and his words carried far more weight than anything he could have said in terms of sanctions. "Your attitude has been deemed unacceptable. You have acted unfairly towards another customer, and we will not tolerate this." The man stood speechless, his face marred with embarrassment, as the hotel employees slowly walked away, their footsteps echoing in the grand lobby, leaving him alone in his humiliation. Every movement, every look exchanged between the employees seemed to be a silent confirmation of his defeat. The man, who until that moment had believed himself untouchable, was now reduced to silence, his authority swept away by a simple truth he could not ignore. In his eyes, frustration and humiliation mixed together, like a poison he couldn't spit out. Yet no one stopped to offer him consolation. The hotel was no longer the field where he used to play to his advantage. But Lena was no longer there to see the scene. She had already left the hotel, head held high, each step resonating as an affirmation of her own inner power. She had not sought to observe the fall of the man who had humiliated her. It wasn't revenge. She had done what she had to do, not to prove a point to anyone, but to prove to herself that she was capable of defending herself, that she deserved respect, that her place in this world, in this hotel, was as legitimate as that of any other person present. Her thoughts were clear, but also free of a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. The grand doors of the hotel closed behind her, and the sound of the outside world enveloped her, but it was not the same world that had greeted her a few hours earlier. The city seemed less imposing that day, as if it had crossed an invisible threshold, a rite of passage that had transformed it. She hadn't tried to be heroic, but what she had just experienced had redefined something in her. She was no longer just another customer. She was a woman who had taken her place, a woman who had asserted herself, who had claimed her right to dignity in a place where she was expected to be invisible. And she would not forget that. The next day, the incident was reported in the local media. Witnesses to the scene began to recount, not with exaggeration but with raw sincerity, how Lena, a black woman, had faced injustice in a calm but determined manner, and how the hotel had made a courageous decision. Witnesses spoke of the surprise, the disbelief, but also the admiration they felt seeing Lena defend herself with imposing dignity, without ever stooping to violence or aggression. Testimonies flooded into social networks, reinforcing the image of this powerful woman who refused to let herself be oppressed by those who thought their status was enough to crush others. Images of the arrogant customer, with his defeated posture and shifty demeanor, were making the rounds on the web. They became symbolic: arrogance in the face of dignity, injustice in the face of integrity. But as the media reported the story, a deeper dimension to the incident emerged. It was not just a clash between a guest and a hotel. It was a clash between two worldviews. One where the elite were above the rules, where race, status, and personal power dictated who was entitled to respect. And the other, embodied by Lena, where human dignity was a universal right, where we did not allow ourselves to be reduced to a role imposed by others. Lena hadn't bragged about it. She was not the type to make a spectacle of herself, to seek recognition or applause. But something inside her had changed that day. She was no longer that woman who went unnoticed in the elegant corners of the city. She was no longer this silent customer who was content with her status as a consumer. She was a woman who had confronted the hierarchy of power and defied it without letting herself be crushed. She was not just a guest in a luxury hotel, but a woman who had reclaimed her place and her dignity, despite those who thought they had the power to take it away from her. She felt different, as if the world around her had suddenly taken on a new meaning. His actions may have been small, but they carried a powerful message. Lena knew that this victory, although personal, was also symbolic. She had faced injustice, but also the invisible burden of what many Black women suffer in silence. She knew that her own experience could resonate with those of so many others, invisible but powerful in their resilience. What she did that day wasn't just defending herself. It was to open a breach in indifference, to show that we could stand up without letting ourselves be crushed, without letting ourselves be erased. In the following days, Lena received messages from women and men, colleagues, friends, and even strangers, who expressed their admiration and support. Some thanked her for giving a voice to the voiceless, for showing how integrity and dignity were more powerful weapons than violence or revenge. Others shared with him their personal experiences, their own struggles against injustice, their own silent battles. These exchanges warmed her heart, but they also reminded her of the responsibility that now weighed on her shoulders. She was no longer a simple spectator of the world, but an actor in her own destiny, a woman who had been able to face a difficult situation and come out stronger. And so, each step she took seemed more confident, more filled with this new inner strength. Lena knew that, despite the small battles to come, she was no longer alone in this struggle. She was part of something bigger, something she had always known, but which the hotel incident had reinforced. Her place in this world depended not on the approval of others, but on the recognition of her own worth. She had made a choice that day. A choice which, although simple, had changed his life and perhaps even that of those who had witnessed his determination.